On to our last picornavirus, rhinovirus. The visual association for this virus should be pretty obvious. Rhinos. So our scene's going to take place at a rhino petting zoo. You know, those good old rhino petting zoos, next to the tiger and grizzly bear petting zoos. Anyway, we have our adult rhino in the back with the baby rhino Pico counterparts in the foreground to remind you, of course, of picornavirus. Remember, rhinovirus is kind of the black sheep, or should I say black rhino, of the picornaviruses. It has some exceptions to the rule. Before we go over the exceptions, do remember that it is a naked virus, as depicted by the statue of David here. Looks like David's got himself a camera. Maybe he's a modern David? We'll explain that later. Let's move on for now. So how is rhinovirus transmitted? Usually through inhalation. Rhinovirus is unique amongst the picornaviruses in that it's acid labile and therefore cannot go through the GI tract. Here we have a tourist at the baby rhino zoo feeding a rhino a lemon. The lemon is our symbol for being acid labile. Remember it from our cholera and salmonella videos? So again, since it is acid labile, it can't go through the GI tract and hence can't get transmitted fecal orally like the rest of the picornaviruses. Instead, it has respiratory transmission. So we'll have one of the baby rhinos sneezing on one of the zoo's guests. Additionally, the virus can be transmitted on fomites, or grubby hands. So that's why it's important to wash your hands to keep from getting a cold. We'll add a sign that says, "Please wash hands after petting rhinos." This will remind you that it can be transmitted through fomites. Pretty obvious since we're talking about the common cold. Okay, let's get into something that's not so obvious. The mechanism of how rhinovirus is transmitted. Let's add another tourist who's leaning into the cage to pet a baby rhino. Notice around the tourist's neck there's a camera, whose strap is being wrapped around the rhino's horn. This illustrates exactly how rhinovirus enters the host cell, by attaching to a molecule called ICAM1. CAM is for camera, and specifically there's only one camera. So again, rhinovirus enters host cells by attaching to ICAM1. And this is why our statue of David has a camera in his hand. Okay, now turn your attention to the back of the enclosure where there are a few rhinos hanging out underneath the shade of a tree. And this is exactly what rhinos do on hot days. They stay in the shade to keep cool. Just like the rhinos, rhinovirus also likes to keep to cooler temperatures and grows best in 33 degrees Celsius, which is slightly cooler than the average body temperature. So let's add a thermometer that reflects the nice cool temperature under the trees. So where in the body can we find these cooler temperatures for rhinovirus to grow? In the upper respiratory tract, where the air is cooler and constantly flowing in and out, acting as a natural air conditioner, much like the shade of the tree. To help remember that it affects the upper respiratory tract, this rhino up front is playing in the mud, like a good rhino, and the mud is dripping down his face, off of his nose, down his chin, and even down on his neck. The rest of the rhino, however, is still gray and untouched. He's just got a mud bath facial. Again, this should help you remember that rhinovirus only affects the upper respiratory tract. Alright, and lastly, you should know that rhinovirus has a ridiculous number of different serotypes. Specifically, there's 113 of them. Although you definitely don't have to remember how many serotypes there are, you should remember that there are a bunch of different flavors of rhinovirus. We'll draw this luxurious canopy here, striped with multiple different colors, to represent the many different serotypes of rhinovirus. And why is this clinically important? If there are 113 serotypes, it's very difficult to make a vaccine to cover all of them. So this is why we have no vaccines for the common cold, at least not yet. So I guess the good news is you don't have to remember any vaccines, and you also don't have to remember any treatments, because there aren't any antiviral treatments. So when your aunt laughs at you for going through 4 years of medical school without knowing how to treat a cold, you'll have to take it. Or you can do what I do and just make up something different every time. So that's about it for rhinovirus. You want to remember the key points, and that's that it's acid labile, and it's transmitted via inhalation, and then everything else should fall into place. And with that, we've wrapped up the picornaviruses. We have a handful more RNA positives to cover, then we'll be done with the whole group. Making progress.